December 18th, 1944, 4:37 in the morning. The location is a nameless, frozen crossroads a few kilometers outside the Belgian village of Poteau. The air itself is the enemy. It is a physical, biting cold that seeps through wool and steel, a cold so profound it feels like the world itself is dying. The Ardennes forest, once a place of quiet, snow-dusted beauty, has become a labyrinth of dread. This is the fourth day of what will come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, and for the men of the U.S. Army's 14th Cavalry Group, the world has shrunk to the size of a rifle sight. In a makeshift command post, a hastily cleared-out Belgian farmhouse, the situation is laid bare in the flickering lamplight. It is not a tactical problem, it is a death sentence. Elements of the 14th, alongside remnants of the 28th Infantry Division, are trapped. They had performed a fighting withdrawal, a strategic retreat, but the speed and ferocity of the German advance, spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Hansen of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had been critically underestimated. The pocket they thought was a defense has become a tomb. They are outnumbered, outgunned, and almost entirely encircled. The road south, their only artery of supply and retreat, is about to be severed. The radio, a lifeline to a world that seems to be forgetting them, crackles with a voice that is calm, distant, and utterly devoid of hope. The order from divisional headquarters is unequivocal, a masterpiece of military stoicism that is in reality a death warrant. It reads, "Hold position at all costs. Do not attempt breakout. Reinforcements are being marshaled. Await further orders." Hold position. For men with frozen rifles and dwindling ammunition, facing down the most elite and ruthless armored force in the German army, those two words are a synonym for die here. Inside a cavernous, stone-walled barn 100 yards from the farmhouse, Technical Sergeant Frank Miller heard those words relayed down the chain of command. He wasn't a cavalryman or an infantryman. He was a combat engineer, a Seabee attached to the army, a man whose job was to build bridges, clear mines, and repair roads. His job was to create order out of chaos. But here, in this frozen corner of hell, the only thing to build was a grave. He stood before his own creation, a machine that was both his pride and a symbol of his defiance. It was an International Harvester TD-14 bulldozer, a piece of heavy construction equipment. But Miller and his small crew had transformed it. Over the past 72 hours of frantic, desperate work, they had welded salvaged steel plates from a knocked-out M8 Greyhound armored car onto its chassis and driver's compartment. It was ugly, clumsy, and utterly unauthorized. Command had seen it 2 days prior and had been furious. It was a waste of resources, a violation of protocol. The machine was to be used for clearing rubble and nothing more. It was, under no circumstances, to be considered a combat vehicle. Frank ran a gloved hand over the cold, welded steel. He could hear the growing chatter of German machine guns from the east, the terrifying, deep-throated cough of an 88mm cannon from the south. The road. They were cutting the road. He looked at the faces of the dozen infantrymen huddled in the barn with him, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhausted resignation. They were boys, most of them, boys from cities they'd never see again. The reinforcements weren't coming, not in time. The order to hold position was just a way for a general somewhere warm to tidy up a map. Frank Miller, a man who had spent his entire life working the soil of central Iowa, a man who understood the simple, brutal logic of planting and harvesting, of life and death, made a decision. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a dramatic pronouncement. It was a quiet turn of the head to his driver, a kid from Chicago named PFC Miller, no relation, who they all called Junior. "Fire it up, Junior," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. The order was a violation of a direct command. It was the single most insubordinate act of his military career. But it was a choice rooted in a deeper logic, the farmer's logic. When the storm is coming and the crop is about to be wiped out, you don't wait for permission to save it. You drive the harvest tractor straight into the heart of the storm. To understand the decision made in that frozen barn, you must first understand the man. Technical Sergeant Frank Miller was not a soldier by nature. He was a farmer, born and raised in the vast, rolling plains outside Ames, Iowa. His world before the war was one of seasons and soil, of the intricate mechanics of combines and tractors. He was a man who spoke the language of engines, who understood the soul of a machine, not from a blueprint, but from the feel of a greasy wrench in his hand and the specific groan a gearbox makes under strain. He grew up in the Great Depression, where nothing was ever thrown away. A broken plow wasn't junk, it was raw material. A dead engine wasn't a loss, it was a source of spare parts. This ingrained philosophy of improvisation, of making something from nothing, was as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands. He saw the world not as a collection of finished objects, but as a vast, interconnected system of problems and potential solutions. A piece of steel wasn't just a piece of steel. It was a future patch, a brace, a weapon. When the war came, his age and his profession as a farmer could have kept him home. But he felt a duty. His unique, almost intuitive understanding of heavy machinery made him a natural fit for the U.S. Navy CBs, the construction battalions whose motto was "Can Do." He built airstrips on Pacific islands and repaired docks in shattered European ports before being attached to the army to support the push into Germany. He was respected not for his rank, but for his quiet competence. He was the man who could get a generator running in a blizzard, the man who could coax a dead engine back to life with little more than a hammer and a well-placed curse. He was, in short, a problem solver. And in December of 1944, he was standing in the middle of the biggest problem of his life. The larger strategic context was a nightmare of Hitler's design. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, was the German dictator's last desperate gamble in the West. He had secretly amassed 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles and thrown them against a thinly held sector of the American lines in the Ardennes. The initial shock had been devastating. The German objective was the port of Antwerp, a key Allied supply hub. To get there, they had to cross the Meuse River. And to get to the Meuse, they had to smash through the small towns and crossroads being held by units like the 14th Cavalry Group. The tip of the German spear in Frank Miller's sector was the infamous 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. This was not a standard army unit. This was the Führer's personal bodyguard, expanded into a fearsome armored division. They were fanatics, political soldiers, equipped with the very best and most terrifying weapons in the German arsenal. Their primary instrument of terror was the Panzer V, the Panther tank. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect balance of speed, armor, and firepower. Its long-barreled 75mm cannon could kill an American Sherman tank from a mile away, long before the Sherman was even in range to fight back. To the average GI, the Panther was not just a tank, it was a monster, a steel predator that haunted the forests and fields of Europe. And now, several of them were methodically grinding their way toward the crossroads Frank Miller had been ordered to hold. Huddled inside the improvised cabin of the armored bulldozer, with Frank was his small, hand-picked team. His driver was Private First Class David Jr. Miller, a wiry, fast-talking kid from the south side of Chicago who had been a taxi driver before the war. He drove the bulldozer with a daredevil's grace, and his constant stream of nervous chatter was the only thing that kept the crushing silence at bay. Manning the salvaged .30 caliber machine gun mounted on the pintle was Corporal Sam Levine, a quiet, stoic mechanic from the Bronx who thought Frank's entire project was insane. He had followed the sergeant's orders, welding the plates and mounting the gun, but his disapproval was a silent, heavy presence in the cold air. Sam believed in regulations and established protocols. Frank's machine, which they had grimly nicknamed the Bulldog, was an affront to everything he understood about the military. The situation outside the barn was deteriorating with horrifying speed. The radio traffic was a chaotic symphony of fear. "Heavy armor spotted on the South Ridge. Looks like Panthers, at least 3 of them. We're being cut off. Charlie Troop is being overrun. Where are those reinforcements? God damn it, where are they?" The replies from command were chilling in their simplicity. "Maintain position. Hold the line. Acknowledge." Frank watched through a crack in the barn door. He could see the muzzle flashes in the pre-dawn gloom getting closer. He saw a platoon of American infantrymen trying to fall back across a frozen field, cut down by the merciless, rhythmic hammering of an MG-42 machine gun. The plan, whatever it was, had failed. The line had broken. Holding this position was no longer a strategy. It was a suicide pact. Time had run out. And Frank Miller, the farmer from Iowa, knew that when your field is on fire, you don't stand still and wait for the rain. You build a fire break. You do it yourself, and you do it now. The plan, born of desperation and a farmer's intimate knowledge of the land, was brutally simple. It wasn't a plan of attack. It was a plan of ambush. Frank had spent the last 2 days observing the terrain with an engineer's eye. Everyone else saw a collection of fields, trees, and buildings. Frank saw gradients, load-bearing surfaces, and choke points. He had watched the German advance, noting its ruthless efficiency. The Panthers were sticking to the main road, using their superior range and armor to methodically eliminate any American position that revealed itself. They were arrogant. They were powerful. And Frank knew that every powerful thing has a weakness. His aha moment came from observing something no one else had paid attention to. A narrow, stone-walled livestock path that ran from behind the barn through a shallow, frozen creek bed and emerged onto the main road at a sharp, almost 90-degree angle. It was completely hidden from the road by a thick stand of pine trees. To a tank commander, the path was useless, too narrow, too rough, too dangerous. But to a driver of a bulldozer, a machine designed to claw its way over the roughest terrain, it was a hidden highway. The German Panthers, advancing in a line, would have their powerful front armor facing the American positions. Their side armor, however, was significantly thinner. More importantly, their turrets, heavy and powered by a hydraulic traverse system, were notoriously slow to turn. If he could get the Bulldog onto the road right beside a Panther before its crew could react. "Junior, you see that path?" Frank shouted over the growl of the idling diesel engine. "You keep it in low gear, don't slip. When we hit the road, you gun it. You aim for the space right behind the lead tank's turret. Sam," he turned to the nervous corporal, "the moment we clear the trees, you open up. Don't aim for the tank, aim for the infantry moving alongside it. Sow confusion, make them think it's a coordinated attack." Sam Levine looked at him, his face pale in the dim light. "This is suicide, Sarge." "No," Frank replied, his voice calm and steady. "Staying here is suicide. This is just a calculated risk." The execution began with a lurch. The bulldog, weighing over 15 tons with its improvised armor, groaned in protest as Junior eased it out of the barn. The steel tracks crunched over the frozen ground. Every sound seemed impossibly loud, a deafening announcement of their insane gamble. They entered the livestock path, the stone walls scraping against their steel plating. Branches from the pine trees clawed at the machine, screeching like fingernails on a blackboard. Inside the cabin, the three men were a study of contrasts. Junior was a bundle of focused energy, his hands dancing over the controls, his eyes locked on the treacherous path. Sam gripped his machine gun, reciting a Hebrew prayer under his breath. And Frank was calm. He was in his element. This was just another piece of heavy machinery and a difficult piece of land. He'd dealt with both his entire life. They reached the edge of the tree line. Through the pines, Frank could see it. The lead Panther. It was even bigger than he had imagined, a looming slate-gray behemoth crawling along the road, its long cannon sniffing the air. It was less than 30 yards away. German infantry clad in white winter camouflage walked alongside it, their rifles at the ready. "Now, Junior, now!" Frank roared. Junior slammed the throttle forward, the bulldog's engine screamed, and the machine surged out of the trees like an enraged animal. For a fraction of a second, there was a moment of pure, unadulterated shock on the faces of the German infantry. They stopped, their mouths agape, trying to process what they were seeing. This metal monster covered in dirt and welded plates, had just burst out of the forest. From the German Panther commander's point of view, peering through his periscope, the world suddenly became a nightmare of utter confusion. His focus was 1,000 yards down the road, searching for anti-tank guns. The last thing he expected was an attack from his immediate flank. He heard a sudden, unfamiliar roar of an engine that wasn't one of his own, and then he saw it. A low, flat-tracked vehicle, not a tank, not an armored car, but something primordial and ugly was charging directly at him. His first thought was that it must be some secret heavy American engineering vehicle, perhaps a mine flail or a demolition tank. He screamed orders into the intercom. "Flank attack, left side, traverse left, fire, fire!" But it was too late. Sam Levine opened up with the .30 caliber, the stream of tracers slashing into the German infantry, forcing them to dive for cover. Their return fire pinged harmlessly off the bulldog's thick, improvised armor. The chaos was the cover Frank needed. In the seconds it took for the Panther's crew to react, for the commander to understand the threat, for the gunner to begin the slow, hydraulic turn of the massive turret, Junior had closed the distance. The bulldog, with all the momentum of its 15 tons, did not fire a shell, it did not launch a rocket. It slammed head-on into the side of the 45-ton Panther. The sound was a cataclysmic shriek of tortured metal, a sound that seemed to rip the fabric of the morning. Frank had instructed Junior to aim for the tracks. The bulldog's reinforced bulldozer blade, designed to move tons of earth, hit the Panther's complex suspension system. Steel teeth bit into steel bogie wheels. A track pen snapped. With a final, groaning tear, the Panther's left track was ripped from its sprockets, rendered useless. The great tank lurched violently and slewed to a halt, crippled. It was a one-legged giant, powerful but immobile. The psychological impact on the German crew was total. They were trapped inside their steel beast, blind on one side and under attack from a vehicle they could not identify. Panic took over. The turret was still trying to traverse, but the bulldog was too close, below the minimum depression of its main gun. The tank commander made a fatal mistake. He opened his hatch to try and get a better look and engage the attacker with his machine gun. Frank was waiting. He raised his M3 grease gun and fired a short, brutal burst. The commander slumped back inside. The controlled collapse began almost immediately. The sight of the lead Panther, the king of the battlefield, being so savagely and bizarrely disabled sent a shockwave of panic through the German column. The second Panther, not wanting to suffer the same fate, halted its advance and began firing blindly into the trees, assuming a major ambush. The German infantry, now without their armored support and still being harassed by Sam's machine gun, fell back into disarray. Frank knew they only had seconds. "Back up, Junior. Get us back in the trees," he yelled. The bulldog, its job done, pulled away from the crippled Panther and retreated into the cover of the forest just as the second Panther's shells began to find their range, exploding where they had been moments before. Through the gap they had created, through the momentary precious window of German confusion, the trapped American soldiers began to escape. They ran, hunched over, from the farmhouse, from the ditches, pouring down the road that the bulldog had just cleared. They were alive. They were free. The legend of what happened that morning began to spread almost immediately. In the chaos of the German retreat, a few days later, captured soldiers from the 1st SS Panzer Division were interrogated. They spoke of a surprise American counterattack. They spoke of a new, heavily armored assault tank, a Bison or Storm Panzer that was incredibly fast at close range and impervious to small arms fire. They never knew the truth. They never knew that the ghost which had haunted them, the secret weapon that had broken their spearhead, was nothing more than a farmer from Iowa, 2 kids from the city, and a very, very angry tractor.
The first validation of Frank Miller's actions came not from an officer or a citation, but from the exhausted, grateful faces of the men he'd saved. As the bulldog limped back to the relative safety of a new American defensive line, soldiers from the 14th Cavalry emerged from the woods to greet it. They slapped its steel plates, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A young lieutenant from a rifle platoon, his face smudged with dirt and fatigue, jogged over to where Frank was climbing down from the driver's compartment. He grabbed Frank's hand, shaking it vigorously. "I don't know who you are, Sergeant," the lieutenant said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And I don't know what the hell that thing is, but you just saved my entire platoon. They had us zeroed in. We were dead. You bought us time we didn't have. Whatever that was, it worked." Frank just nodded, too tired and overwhelmed to speak. He had been so focused on the mechanics of the problem, on the angles and the timing, that the human consequence of his actions was only just beginning to sink in. He had saved these men. The formal reckoning, however, was far less celebratory. Later that day, covered in grease and smelling of diesel fumes, Frank was summoned to a temporary command post. He stood before a Captain Richards, a young, ambitious officer straight from West Point, a man who believed that the war could be won through neat lines on a map and strict adherence to the field manual. Richards' face was a mask of cold fury. "Sergeant Miller," the captain began, his voice tight and clipped, "I have just received a preliminary field report. It seems a piece of engineering equipment assigned to your section, a TD-14 bulldozer to be precise, was involved in an unauthorized engagement with an enemy armored vehicle. Is this report accurate?" "Yes, sir," Frank said simply. The captain stared at him, incredulous. "You took a bulldozer, a piece of construction equipment, and you used it to attack a Panzer V tank." "We disabled it, sir." "Yes. You do understand that you violated a direct order to hold your position and not to engage," Captain Richards continued, his voice rising. "You commandeered Army property for a purpose for which it was not designed. You willfully risked the destruction of a valuable piece of engineering hardware.
That is a direct violation of at least a dozen standing engagement rules and articles of war."
Frank stood at attention, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the captain's head. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to explain the desperation of the moment. He simply stated the problem and its solution in the only terms he knew, the terms of a farmer. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice quiet but firm. But the Germans were about to close the road. The men in the farmhouse, the cavalry scouts, they were all going to be killed. The choice, as I saw it, sir, was to lose the tractor or lose 30 or 40 men. I chose to lose the tractor. The captain's face went red. He was about to unleash a tirade, to threaten a court-martial, when a deeper voice cut through the tension from the corner of the tent. "Is that what you did, Sergeant?" Frank turned to see a full colonel, a man in his late 50s, with tired eyes and the weathered face of a career soldier, step forward. It was Colonel Mark Devine, the regimental commander. He had been listening to the entire exchange. "Yes, Colonel," Frank said. Colonel Devine walked slowly around Frank, then walked over to the captain. He put a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Captain," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Are you aware that the 30 or 40 men this sergeant saved included the regimental intelligence section and most of my forward observers? Are you aware that because the German advance in this sector was stalled for a critical 90 minutes, we were able to establish a new defensive line 3 miles from here instead of 5? Are you aware that the piece of engineering hardware in question is currently being hailed as a secret American tank by the very SS troopers we have been unable to break for the past 4 days? Captain Richards was silent, his face a mixture of embarrassment and shock. Colonel Devine turned back to Frank. He looked at the sergeant's grease-stained uniform, his exhausted eyes, the calloused hands that had saved a company. He did not smile, but the hardness in his eyes softened for a moment. "Sergeant," the colonel said, "I have read the report, and I am officially logging that your bulldozer was regrettably disabled by enemy artillery fire while performing its assigned task of clearing debris from a roadway. It seems your crew, in a heroic act of self-preservation, managed to inadvertently collide with an enemy vehicle in the process. A tragic but understandable accident." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I never want to see that monstrous thing you built used in a combat role ever again. It is a violation of doctrine. Is that clear?" "Yes, Colonel. Crystal clear," Frank replied. "Good," the colonel said, turning to leave. He stopped at the tent flap and looked back. "But, off the record, Sergeant, good work." Frank Miller never received a medal for what he did that day. There was no parade, no official recognition. 3 months later, he was quietly awarded a Bronze Star. The citation, however, made no mention of a bulldozer or a Panther tank. It was for meritorious service and exceptional bravery in the face of the enemy during the Ardennes campaign. The real story, the unbelievable story of the Bulldog, was deliberately, and perhaps wisely, buried in the paperwork of the war. It became a rumor, a ghost story told by the men who were there, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most brilliant victories are the ones that are never officially recorded.
The story of Frank Miller and his bulldog did not end in that tent. While it was erased from the official records, it survived in the collective memory of the soldiers who witnessed it. And like a seed planted in fertile ground, its core idea began to grow. The concept of using heavy, armored engineering vehicles in a direct offensive capacity was, at the time, unheard of. But the story of the ghost tractor of the Ardennes circulated as a battlefield legend. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers, the men responsible for innovation at the tactical level, heard the whispers. They understood the brutal logic of what Miller had done. After the war, during the military's extensive post-conflict analysis, a new term began to appear in the reports and studies of the Army Corps of Engineers. They called it Field Expedient Assault Engineering. It was a dry, technical term for a radical idea: that bulldozers with added armor and weapons could be used to destroy enemy fortifications, create breaches in defensive lines, and even, in desperate circumstances, function as close-quarters anti-tank weapons. Doctrine began to shift. The Army started developing official armored bulldozer kits. Decades later, during the wars in Vietnam and the Middle East, the concept would be fully realized in vehicles like the Israeli D9 armored bulldozer, a terrifying machine used to clear enemy positions and detonate explosives. These modern marvels of military engineering, in a very real way, are the direct descendants of an unauthorized, ugly machine built in a Belgian barn by a farmer from Iowa. Frank Miller's forbidden idea had, over time, become official military doctrine. The third-party validation, the proof that this was not just a fluke, exists in the scattered archives of the war. A debriefing report from the 2nd Armored Division, which later relieved the units in the sector, noted persistent, though unconfirmed reports from enemy prisoners of war regarding a heavy assault tractor used by American forces. An after-action report from the 14th Cavalry Group itself contains a cryptic entry for December 18th. At 0440 hours, enemy armored advance on the South Road was unexpectedly and decisively halted by the aggressive actions of an attached engineering element. But the most powerful testimony comes from the men themselves. Private First Class Harold Jensen, one of the infantrymen who escaped from the farmhouse, wrote a letter to his parents a week later. In it, he said, "We were trapped. Done for. The Krauts had a Panther tank sitting on the road just picking us off. Then, out of nowhere, this monster of a tractor charged out of the woods and just tore that tank apart. I've never seen anything like it. I don't know the name of the guy who was driving it or the sergeant who was commanding it, but I know this: I owe him everything. I am alive today because of that crazy, beautiful tractor." After the war, Frank Miller went home. He returned to his farm outside Ames, Iowa. He traded his Army fatigues for denim overalls. He went back to his life of planting and harvesting, of fixing engines and watching the seasons change. He never spoke of the war, not to his wife, not to his children, not to his friends. His neighbors saw him as a good farmer, a quiet and humble man who was good with his hands. They never knew that for a brief, terrifying morning, those same hands had piloted a homemade tank and saved the lives of 40 men. The war was a lifetime ago, a different world, a different man.
The emotional climax of this story, the key to understanding the man himself, was not found in a military archive, but in a dusty shoebox in an Iowa attic. Discovered by his grandson decades after his death, it was a letter, written by Frank to his wife Eleanor on Christmas Eve, 1944, just 6 days after the incident. He couldn't tell her what he had done. Not specifically. But in the letter, he tried to explain the choice he had made, in the only way he knew how. My dearest Ellie, it's Christmas Eve, and it's cold here. A cold that gets right into your bones. It's hard to feel much like Christmas. I see a lot of things here I don't understand. A lot of waste. A lot of broken machines and broken boys. A few days ago, I had to make a choice. It wasn't a choice they teach you in the books. It was a choice about a piece of machinery. A very expensive, powerful piece of German machinery that was causing a lot of trouble. And I looked at it, and I wasn't scared. Because all I saw was a big, complicated engine with a flaw. Back home, when a combine gets stuck in the mud, you don't stand there staring at it. You get the old tractor, you put a chain on it, and you pull it out. You don't ask permission. You just see the problem, and you solve it with the tools you have. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm still a farmer, Ellie. I'm just farming in a different field. I hope to be home soon. All my love, Frank. That was his final confession. The justification for his act of brilliant insubordination. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was just a farmer, solving a problem with the tools he had. He saw the Panther not as a mythical beast, but as a machine. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life working with his hands, that any machine can be broken. And maybe that's the real lesson of Frank Miller's story, that sometimes history isn't made by the generals with their grand strategies, but by the quiet, competent people who refuse to accept that a problem is impossible. The ones who see the world not for what it is, but for what it could be, with a little grease, a little steel, and a whole lot of courage. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of genius don't come from a classroom or a manual, but from the simple, irrefutable logic of a farmer's field. If you want to learn more about the incredible, untold stories of ingenuity and courage from the Second World War, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Explained and click the bell to be notified of our next character study. And let us know in the comments below, what other unsung heroes should we cover next? Thank you for watching.